Section 14 of The Crowd by Gustave Le Bon. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Oxenhandler. Book 3, Chapter 5. Parliamentary Assemblies. Parliamentary crowds present most of the characteristics common to heterogeneous crowds that are not anonymous: the simplicity of their opinions, their suggestibility and its limits, their indestructible fixed opinions and their changed opinions, the reason of the predominance of indecision, the role of the leaders, the reason of their prestige. They are true masters of an assembly whose votes, on that account, are merely those of a small minority. The absolute power they exercise, the elements of their oratorical act, phrases and images, the psychological necessity the leaders are under of being in a general way of stubborn convictions and narrow-minded. It is impossible for a speaker without prestige to obtain recognition for his arguments. The exaggeration of the sentiments, whether good or bad, of assemblies. At certain moments they become automatic. The sittings of the convention, cases in which an assembly loses the characteristics of crowds. The influence of specialists when technical questions arise. The advantages and dangers of a parliamentary system in all countries. It is adapted to modern needs, but it involves financial waste and the progressive curtailment of all liberty. Conclusion. In parliamentary assemblies we have an example of heterogeneous crowds that are not anonymous. Although the mode of election of their members varies from epoch to epoch and from nation to nation, they present very similar characteristics. In this case the influence of the race makes itself felt to weaken or exaggerate the characteristics common to crowds, but not to prevent their manifestation. The parliamentary assemblies of the most widely different countries, of Greece, Italy, Portugal, Spain, France, and America, present great analogies in their debates and votes, and leave the respective governments face to face with identical difficulties. Moreover, the parliamentary system represents the ideal of all modern civilized peoples. The system is the expression of the idea, psychologically erroneous, but generally admitted, that a large gathering of men is much more capable than a small number of coming to a wise and independent decision on a given subject. The general characteristics of crowds are to be met with in parliamentary assemblies: intellectual simplicity, irritability, suggestibility, the exaggeration of the sentiments, and the preponderating influence of a few leaders. In consequence, however, of their special composition, parliamentary crowds offer some distinctive features, which we shall point out shortly. Simplicity in their opinions is one of their most important characteristics. In the case of all parties, and more especially so far as the Latin peoples are concerned, an invariable tendency is met with in crowds of this kind to solve the most complicated social problems by the simplest abstract principles and general laws applicable to all cases. Naturally, the principles vary with the party, but owing to the mere fact that the individual members are a part of a crowd, they are always inclined to exaggerate the worth of their principles and to push them to their extreme consequences. In consequence, parliaments are more especially representative of extreme opinions. The most perfect example of the ingenuous simplification of opinions peculiar to assemblies is offered by the Jacobins of the French Revolution. Dogmatic and logical to a man, and their brains full of vague generalities, they busied themselves with the application of fixed principles, without concerning themselves with the events. It has been said of them with reason that they went through the revolution without witnessing it. With the aid of the very simple dogmas that served them as guide, they imagined they could recast society from top to bottom, and cause a highly refined civilization to return to a very anterior phase of the social evolution. The methods they resorted to realize their dream wore the same stamp of absolute ingenuousness. They confined themselves in reality to destroying what stood in their way. All of them, moreover, Girondists, the men of the mountain, the Thermidorians, etc., were alike animated by the same spirit. Parliamentary crowds are very open to suggestion, and, as in the case of all crowds, the suggestion comes from leaders possessing prestige, but the suggestibility of parliamentary assemblies has very clearly defined limits, which it is important to point out. On all questions of local or regional interest, every member of an assembly has fixed, unalterable opinions, which no amount of argument can shake. The talent of a Demosthenes would be powerless to change the vote of a deputy on such questions as protection or the privilege of distilling alcohol, questions in which the interests of influential electors are involved. The suggestion emanating from these electors and undergone before the time to vote arrives sufficiently outweighs suggestions from any other source to annul them and to maintain an absolute fixity of opinion. Footnote: the following reflection of an English parliamentarian of long experience doubtless applies to these opinions. Fixed beforehand and rendered unalterable by electioneering necessities, "During the 50 years that I have sat at Westminster, I have listened to thousands of speeches, but few of them have changed my opinion, not one of them has changed my vote." End of footnote. On general questions, the overthrow of a cabinet, the imposition of a tax, etc., there is no longer any fixity of opinion, and the suggestions of leaders can exert an influence, though not in quite the same way as in an ordinary crowd. Every party has its leaders who possess occasionally an equal influence. The result is that the deputy finds himself placed between two contrary suggestions, and is inevitably made to hesitate. This explains how it is that he is often seen to vote in contrary fashion in an interval of a quarter of an hour, or to add to a law an article which nullifies it. For instance, to withdraw from employers of labour the right of choosing and dismissing their workmen, and then to very nearly annul this measure by an amendment. It is for the same reason that every chamber that is returned has some very stable opinions, and other opinions that are very shifting. On the whole, the general question being the more numerous, indecision is predominant in the chamber, the indecision which results from the ever-present fear of the elector, the suggestion received from whom is always latent, and tends to counterbalance the influence of the leaders. Still, it is the leaders who are definitely the masters in those numerous discussions, with regard to the subject matter of which the members of an assembly are without strong preconceived opinions. The necessity of these leaders is evident, since under the name of heads of groups they are met with in the assemblies of every country. They are the real rulers of an assembly. Men forming a crowd cannot do without a master, whence it results that the votes of an assembly only represent, as a rule, the opinions of a small minority. The influence of the leaders is due in very small measure to the arguments they employ, but in a large degree to their prestige. The best proof of this is that should they by any circumstance lose their prestige, their influence disappears. The prestige of these political leaders is individual and independent of name or celebrity, a fact of which M. Jules Simon gives us some very curious examples in his remarks on the prominent men of the Assembly of 1848, of which he was a member. 2 months before he was all-powerful, Louis Napoleon was entirely without the least importance. Victor Hugo mounted the tribune. He failed to achieve success. He was listened to as Felix Pyat was listened to, but he did not obtain as much applause. "I don't like his ideas," Vaulabelle said to me, speaking of Felix Pyat, "but he is one of the greatest writers and the greatest orator of France." Edgar Quinet, in spite of his exceptional and powerful intelligence, was held in no esteem whatever. He had been popular for a while before the opening of the Assembly. In the Assembly he had no popularity. "The splendour of genius makes itself less felt in political assemblies than anywhere else. They only give heed to eloquence appropriate to the time and place and to party services, not to services rendered the country. For homage to be rendered Lamartine in 1848 and Thiers in 1871, the stimulant was needed of urgent, inexorable interest. As soon as the danger was past, the parliamentary world forgot in the same instant its gratitude and its fright." I have quoted the preceding passage for the sake of the facts it contains, not of the explanations it offers, their psychology being somewhat poor. A crowd would at once lose its character of a crowd were it to credit its leaders with their services, whether of a party nature or rendered their country. The crowd that obeys a leader is under the influence of his prestige, and its submission is not dictated by any sentiment of interest or gratitude. In consequence, the leader endowed with sufficient prestige yields almost absolute power. The immense influence exerted during a long series of years, thanks to his prestige, by a celebrated deputy, (footnote M. Clemenceau, note of the translator), beaten at the last general election in consequence of certain financial events, is well known. He had only to give the signal and cabinets were overthrown. A writer has clearly indicated the scope of his action in the following lines. Quote, "It is due, in the main, to M.X. that we paid 3 times as dearly as we should have done for Tonkin, that we remained so long on a precarious footing in Madagascar, that we were defrauded of an empire in the region of the Lower Niger, and that we have lost the preponderating situation we used to occupy in Egypt. The theories of M.X. have cost us more territories than the disasters of Napoleon I." Unquote. We must not harbour too bitter a grudge against the leader in question. It is plain that he has cost us very dear, but a great part of his influence was due to the fact that he followed public opinion, which in colonial matters was far from being at the time what it has since become. A leader is seldom in advance of public opinion. Almost always all he does is to follow it and to espouse all its errors. The means of persuasion of the leaders we are dealing with, apart from their prestige, consist in the factors we have already enumerated several times. To make a skilful use of these resources, a leader must have arrived at a comprehension, at least in an unconscious manner, of the psychology of crowds, and must know how to address them. He should be aware, in particular, of the fascinating influence of words, phrases, and images. He should possess a special description of eloquence, composed of energetic affirmations, unburdened with proofs, and impressive images, accompanied by very summary arguments. This is a kind of eloquence that is met with in all assemblies, the English Parliament included, the most serious though it is of all. Quote, "Debates in the House of Commons," unquote, says the English philosopher Maine, quote, "may be constantly read in which the entire discussion is confined to an exchange of rather weak generalities and rather violent personalities. General formulas of this description exercise a prodigious influence on the imagination of a pure democracy. It will always be easy to make a crowd accept general assertions presented in striking terms, although they have never been verified and are perhaps not susceptible of verification." Unquote. Too much importance cannot be attached to the quote, "striking terms" unquote, alluded to in the above quotation. We have already insisted on several occasions on the special power of words and formulas. They must be chosen in such a way as to evoke very vivid images. The following phrase, taken from a speech by one of the leaders of our assemblies, affords an excellent example. Quote, "When the same vessel shall bear away to the fever-haunted lands of our penitentiary settlements the politician of shady reputation and the anarchist guilty of murder, the pair will be able to converse together, and they will appear to each other as the two complementary aspects of one and the same state of society." Unquote. The image thus evoked is very vivid, and all the adversaries of the speaker felt themselves threatened by it. They conjured up a double vision of the fever-haunted country and the vessel that may carry them away, for is it not possible that they are included in the somewhat ill-defined category of the politicians menaced? They experienced the lurking fear that the men of the Convention must have felt, whom the vague speeches of Robespierre threatened with the guillotine, and who, under the influence of this fear, invariably yielded to him. It is all to the interest of the leaders to indulge in the most improbable exaggerations. The speaker of whom I have just cited a sentence was able to affirm, without arousing violent protestations, that bankers and priests had subsidized the throwers of bombs, and that the directors of the great financial companies deserved the same punishment as anarchists. Affirmations of this kind are always effective with crowds. The affirmation is never too violent, the declamation never too threatening. Nothing intimidates the audience more than this sort of eloquence. Those present are afraid that if they protest, they will be put down as traitors or accomplices. As I have said, this peculiar style of eloquence has ever been of sovereign effect in all assemblies. In times of crisis its power is still further accentuated. The speeches of the great orators of the assemblies of the French Revolution are very interesting reading from this point of view. At every instant they thought themselves obliged to pause in order to denounce crime and exalt virtue, after which they would burst forth into imprecations against tyrants, and swear to live free men or perish. Those present rose to their feet, applauded furiously, and then, calmed, took their seats again. On occasion the leader may be intelligent and highly educated, but the possession of these qualities does him, as a rule, more harm than good. By showing how complex things are, by allowing of explanation and promoting comprehension, intelligence always renders its owner indulgent, and blunts in a large measure the intensity and violence of conviction needful for apostles. The great leaders of crowds of all ages, and those of the Revolution in particular, have been of lamentably narrow intellect, while it is precisely those whose intelligence has been the most restricted who have exercised the greatest influence. The speeches of the most celebrated of them, of Robespierre, frequently astound one by their incoherence. By merely reading them no plausible explanation is to be found of the great part played by the powerful dictator. Quote, "The commonplaces and redundancies of pedagogic eloquence and Latin culture at the service of a mind childish rather than undistinguished, and limited in its notions of attack and defence to the defiant attitude of schoolboys, not an idea, not a happy turn of phrase, or a telling hit, a storm of declamation that leaves us bored. After a dose of this unexhilarating reading, one is tempted to exclaim, quote, 'Oh,' unquote, with the amiable Camille Desmoulins." Unquote. It is terrible at times to think of the power that strong conviction, combined with extreme narrowness of mind, gives a man possessing prestige. It is none the less necessary that these conditions should be satisfied for a man to ignore obstacles and display strength of will in a high measure. Crowds instinctively recognize in men of energy and conviction the masters they are always in need of. In a parliamentary assembly the success of a speech depends almost solely on the prestige possessed by the speaker, and not at all on the arguments he brings forward. The best proof of this is that when for one cause or another a speaker loses his prestige, he loses simultaneously all his influence, that is, his power of influencing votes at will. When an unknown speaker comes forward with a speech containing good arguments, but only arguments, the chances are that he will only obtain a hearing. A deputy who is a psychologist of insight, M. de Saubes, has recently traced in the following lines the portrait of the deputy who lacks prestige. Quote, "When he takes his place in the tribune he draws a document from his portfolio, spreads it out methodically before him, and makes a start with assurance. He flatters himself that he will implant in the minds of his audience the conviction by which he is himself animated. He has weighed and reweighed his arguments. He is well primed with figures and proofs. He is certain he will convince his hearers. In the face of the evidence he is to adduce, all resistance would be futile. He begins confident in the justice of his cause, and relying upon the attention of his colleagues, whose only anxiety, of course, is to subscribe to the truth. He speaks and is at once surprised at the restlessness of the House, and a little annoyed by the noise that is being made. How is it silence is not kept? Why this general inattention? What are those deputies thinking about who are engaged in conversation? What urgent motive has induced this or that deputy to quit his seat? An expression of uneasiness crosses his face. He frowns and stops. Encouraged by the president, he begins again, raising his voice. He is only listened to all the less. He lends emphasis to his words, and gesticulates. The noise around him increases. He can no longer hear himself, and again stops. Finally, afraid that his silence may provoke the dreaded cry, "The closure," he starts off again. The clamour becomes unbearable. When parliamentary assemblies reach a certain pitch of excitement, they become identical with ordinary heterogeneous crowds, and their sentiments in consequence present the peculiarity of being always extreme. They will be seen to commit acts of the greatest heroism or the worst excesses. The individual is no longer himself, and so entirely is this the case that he will vote measures most adverse to his personal interests. The history of the French Revolution shows to what an extent assemblies are capable of losing their self-consciousness and of obeying suggestions most contrary to their interests. It was an enormous sacrifice for the nobility to renounce its privileges, yet it did so without hesitation on a famous night during the sittings of the Constituent Assembly. By renouncing their inviolability, the men of the Convention placed themselves under a perpetual menace of death, and yet they took this step and were not afraid to decimate their own ranks, though perfectly aware that the scaffold to which they were sending their colleagues today might be their own fate tomorrow. The truth is they had attained to that completely automatic state which I have described elsewhere, and no consideration would hinder them from yielding to the suggestions by which they were hypnotized. The following passage from the memoirs of one of them, Billaud Varennes, is absolutely typical on this score. "The decisions with which we have been so reproached," he says, "were not desired by us 2 days, a single day before they were taken. It was the crisis and nothing else that gave rise to them." Nothing can be more accurate. The same phenomena of unconsciousness were to be witnessed during all the stormy sittings of the Convention. "They approved and decreed measures," says Taine, "which they held in horror, measures which were not only stupid and foolish, but measures that were crimes, the murder of innocent men, the murder of their friends. The left, supported by the right, unanimously and amid loud applause, sent to the scaffold Danton, its natural chief, and the great promoter and leader of the revolution. Unanimously and amid the greatest applause, the right, supported by the left, votes the worst decrees of the revolutionary government. Unanimously and amid cries of admiration and enthusiasm, amid demonstrations of passionate sympathy for Collot d'Herbois, Couthon, and Robespierre, the Convention, by spontaneous and repeated re-elections, keeps in office the homicidal government which the plain detests because it is homicidal, and the mountain detests because it is decimated by it. The plain and the mountain, the majority and the minority, finish by consenting to help on their own suicide. The 22 prairial, the entire Convention offered itself to the executioner. The 8th Thermidor, during the first quarter of an hour that followed Robespierre's speech, it did the same thing again." This picture may appear sombre, yet it is accurate. Parliamentary assemblies, sufficiently excited and hypnotized, offer the same characteristics. They become an unstable flock, obedient to every impulsion. The following description of the Assembly of 1848 is due to M. Spuller, a parliamentarian whose faith in democracy is above suspicion. I reproduce it from the Revue littéraire, and it is thoroughly typical. It offers an example of all the exaggerated sentiments which I have described as characteristic of crowds, and of that excessive changeableness which permits of assemblies passing from moment to moment from one set of sentiments to another entirely opposite. The Republican party was brought to its perdition by its divisions, its jealousies, its suspicions, and, in turn, its blind confidence and its limitless hopes. Its ingenuousness and candour were only equalled by its universal mistrust. An absence of all sense of legality, of all comprehension of discipline, together with boundless terrors and illusions. The peasant and the child are on a level in these respects. Their calm is as great as their impatience. Their ferocity is equal to their docility. This condition is the natural consequence of a temperament that is not formed and of the lack of education. Nothing astonishes such persons, and everything disconcerts them. Trembling with the fear, or brave to the point of heroism, they would go through fire and water, or fly from a shadow. Quote, "They are ignorant of cause and effect, and of the connecting links between events. They are as promptly discouraged as they are exalted. They are subject to every description of panic. They are always either too highly strung or too downcast, but never in the mood or the measure the situation would require. More fluid than water, they reflect every line and assume every shape. What sort of a foundation for a government can they be expected to supply?" Unquote. Fortunately, all the characteristics just described as to be met with in parliamentary assemblies are in no wise constantly displayed. Such assemblies only constitute crowds at certain moments. The individuals composing them retain their individuality in a great number of cases, which explains how it is that an assembly is able to turn out excellent technical laws. It is true that the author of these laws is a specialist who has prepared them in the quiet of his study, and that in reality the law voted is the work of an individual and not of an assembly. These laws are naturally the best. They are only liable to have disastrous results when a series of amendments has converted them into the outcome of a collective effort. The work of a crowd is always inferior, whatever its nature, to that of an isolated individual. It is specialists who safeguard assemblies from passing ill-advised or unworkable measures. The specialist in this case is a temporary leader of crowds. The assembly is without influence on him, but he has influence over the assembly. In spite of all the difficulties attending their working, parliamentary assemblies are the best form of government mankind has discovered as yet, and more especially the best means it has found to escape the yoke of personal tyrannies. They constitute assuredly the ideal government, at any rate for philosophers, thinkers, writers, artists, and learned men, in a word, for all those who form the cream of a civilization. Moreover, in reality, they only present two serious dangers, one being inevitable financial waste, and the other the progressive restriction of the liberty of the individual. The first of these dangers is the necessary consequence of the exigencies and want of foresight of electoral crowds. Should a member of an assembly propose a measure giving apparent satisfaction to democratic ideas, should he bring in a bill, for instance, to assure old age pensions to all workers, and to increase the wages of any class of state employees, the other deputies, victims of suggestion in their dread of their electors, will not venture to seem to disregard the interests of the latter by rejecting the proposed measure, although well aware they are imposing a fresh strain on the budget and necessitating the creation of new taxes. It is impossible for them to hesitate to give their votes. The consequences of the increase of expenditure are remote and will not entail disagreeable consequences for them personally, while the consequences of a negative vote might clearly come to light when they next present themselves for re-election. In addition to this first cause of an exaggerated expenditure, there is another not less imperative, the necessity of voting all grants for local purposes. A deputy is unable to oppose grants of this kind because they represent once more the exigencies of the electors, and because each individual deputy can only obtain what he requires for his own constituency on the condition of acceding to similar demands on the part of his colleagues. Footnote: In its issue of April 6, 1895, The Economist published a curious review of the figures that may be reached by expenditure caused solely by electoral considerations, and notably of the outlay on railways. To put Langeais, a town of 3,000 inhabitants situated on a mountain, in communication with Puy, a railway is voted that will cost 15 millions of francs. 7 millions are to be spent to put Beaumont, 3,500 inhabitants, in communication with Castel Sarrazin. 7 millions to put Aoust, a village of 523 inhabitants, in communication with Seix, 1,200 inhabitants. 6 millions to put Prades in communication with Hamlet of Olette, 747 inhabitants, etc. In 1895 alone, 90 millions of francs were voted for railways of only local utility. There is other no less important expenditure necessitated also by electioneering considerations. The law instituting working men's pensions will soon involve a minimum annual outlay of 165 millions, according to the Minister of Finance, and of 800 millions, according to the academician M. Leroy Beaulieu. It is evident that the continued growth of expenditure of this kind must end in bankruptcy. Many European countries, Portugal, Greece, Spain, Turkey, have reached this stage, and others, such as Italy, will soon be reduced to the same extremity. Still, too much alarm need not be felt at this state of things, since the public has successively consented to put up with the reduction of 4/5 in the payment of their coupons by these different countries. Bankruptcy under these ingenious conditions allows the equilibrium of budgets, difficult to balance, to be instantly restored. Moreover, wars, socialism, and economic conflicts hold in store for us a profusion of other catastrophes in the period of universal disintegration we are traversing, and it is necessary to be resigned to living from hand to mouth without too much concern for a future we cannot control. End of footnote. The second of the dangers referred to above, the inevitable restrictions on liberty consummated by parliamentary assemblies, is apparently less obvious, but is, nevertheless, very real. It is the result of the innumerable laws having always a restrictive action, which parliaments consider themselves obliged to vote, and to whose consequence, owing to their short-sightedness, they are in a great measure blind. The danger must indeed be most inevitable, since even England itself, which assuredly offers the most popular type of the parliamentary regime, the type in which the representative is most independent of his elector, has been unable to escape it. Herbert Spencer has shown in a work already old that the increase of apparent liberty must needs be followed by the decrease of real liberty. Returning to this contention in his recent book, "The Individual versus the State," he thus expresses himself with regard to the English Parliament. Legislation since this period has followed the course I pointed out. Rapidly multiplying dictatorial measures have continually tended to restrict individual liberties, and this in two ways. Regulations have been established every year in greater number, imposing a constraint on the citizen in matters in which his acts were formerly completely free, and forcing him to accomplish acts which he was formerly at liberty to accomplish, or not to accomplish at will. At the same time, heavier and heavier public, and especially local, burdens have still further restricted his liberty by diminishing the portion of his profits he can spend as he chooses, and by augmenting the portion which is taken from him to be spent according to the good pleasure of the public authorities." This progressive restriction of liberties shows itself in every country in a special shape which Herbert Spencer has not pointed out. It is that the passing of these innumerable series of legislative measures, all of them in a general way of a restrictive order, conduces necessarily to augment the number, the power, and the influence of the functionaries charged with their application. These functionaries tend in this way to become the veritable masters of civilized countries. Their power is all the greater owing to the fact that, amidst the incessant transfer of authority, the administrative caste is alone in being untouched by these changes, is alone in possessing irresponsibility, impersonality, and perpetuity. There is no more oppressive despotism than that which presents itself under this triple form. This incessant creation of restrictive laws and regulations, surrounding the pettiest actions of existence with the most complicated formalities, inevitably has for its result the confining within narrower and narrower limits of the sphere in which the citizen may move freely. Victims of the delusion that equality and liberty are the better assured by the multiplication of laws, nations daily consent to put up with trammels increasingly burdensome. They do not accept this legislation with impunity. Accustomed to put up with every yoke, they soon end by desiring servitude, and lose all spontaneousness and energy. They are then no more than vain shadows, passive, unresisting, and powerless automata. Arrived at this point, the individual is bound to seek outside himself the forces he no longer finds within him. The functions of governments necessarily increase in proportion as the indifference and helplessness of the citizens grow. They it is who must necessarily exhibit the initiative, enterprising, and guiding spirit in which private persons are lacking. It falls on them to undertake everything, direct everything, and take everything under their protection. The state becomes an all-powerful god. Still, experience shows that the power of such gods was never either very durable or very strong. This progressive restriction of all liberties in the case of certain peoples, in spite of an outward license that gives them the illusion that these liberties are still in their possession, seems at least as much a consequence of their old age as of any particular system. It constitutes one of the precursory symptoms of that decadent phase which up to now no civilization has escaped. Judging by the lessons of the past and by the symptoms that strike the attention on every side, several of our modern civilizations have reached that phase of extreme old age which precedes decadence. It seems inevitable that all peoples should pass through identical phases of existence, since history is so often seen to repeat its course. It is easy to note briefly these common phases of the evolution of civilizations, and I shall terminate this work with a summary of them. The rapid sketch will perhaps throw some gleams of light on the causes of the power at present yielded by crowds. If we examine in their main lines the genesis of the greatness and of the fall of the civilizations that preceded our own, what do we see? At the dawn of civilization, a swarm of men of various origin, brought together by the chances of migrations, invasions, and conquests, of different blood and of equally different languages and beliefs, the only common bond of union between these men is the half-recognized law of a chief. The psychological characteristics of a crowd are present in an eminent degree in these confused agglomerations. They have the transient cohesion of crowds, their heroism, their weakness, their impulsiveness, and their violence. Nothing is stable in connection with them. They are barbarians. At length time accomplishes its work. The identity of surroundings, the repeated intermingling of races, the necessities of life in common exert their influence. The assemblage of dissimilar units begins to blend into a whole to form a race, that is, an aggregate possessing common characteristics and sentiments to which heredity will give greater and greater fixity. The crowd has become a people, and this people is able to emerge from its barbarous state. However, it will only entirely emerge therefrom when, after long efforts, struggles necessarily repeated, and innumerable recommencements, it shall have acquired an ideal. The nature of this ideal is of slight importance, whether it be the cult of Rome, the might of Athens, or the triumph of Allah. It will suffice to endow all the individuals of the race that is forming with perfect unity of sentiment and thought. At this stage a new civilization with its institutions, its beliefs, and its arts may be born. In pursuit of its ideal, the race will acquire in succession the qualities necessary to give it splendor, vigor, and grandeur. At times, no doubt, it will still be a crowd, but henceforth beneath the mobile and changing characteristics of crowds is found a solid substratum, the genius of the race, which confines within narrow limits the transformations of a nation and overrules the play of chance. After having exerted its creative action, time begins that work of destruction from which neither gods nor men escape. Having reached a certain level of strength and complexity, a civilization ceases to grow, and having ceased to grow, it is condemned to a speedy decline. The hour of its old age has struck. This inevitable hour is always marked by the weakening of the ideal that was the mainstay of the race, in proportion as this ideal pales all the religious, political, and social structures inspired by it begin to be shaken. With the progressive perishing of its ideal, the race loses more and more the qualities that lent it its cohesion, its unity, and its strength. The personality and intelligence of the individual may increase, but at the same time this collective egoism of the race is replaced by an excessive development of the egoism of the individual, accompanied by a weakening of character and a lessening of the capacity for action. What constituted a people, a unity, a whole, becomes in the end an agglomeration of individualities lacking cohesion, and artificially held together for a time by its traditions and institutions. It is at this stage that men, divided by their interests and aspirations, and incapable any longer of self-government, require directing in their pettiest acts, and that the state exerts an absorbing influence. With the definite loss of its old ideal, the genius of the race entirely disappears. It is a mere swarm of isolated individuals, and returns to its original state, that of a crowd. Without consistency and without a future, it has all the transitory characteristics of crowds. Its civilization is now without stability and at the mercy of every chance. The populace is sovereign, and the tide of barbarism mounts. The civilization may still seem brilliant because it possesses an outward front, the work of a long past, but it is in reality an edifice crumbling to ruin, which nothing supports, and destined to fall in at the first storm. To pass in pursuit of an ideal from the barbarous to the civilized state, and then, when this ideal has lost its virtue, to decline and die, such is the cycle of the life of a people. End of Book 3, Chapter 5. End of The Crowd by Gustave Le Bon.